And we're live. Oliver, go for it.
Hello.
Hi, Oliver.
Everyone.
Hi, Oliver.
Yes. Yeah. So this is our rendezvous. I think we can start. Is everyone here? Has everyone joined?
Yes, we are. We're here.
Yeah.
Yes. So welcome to this webinar, and this is a conversation happening, organized by African Queer Youth Initiative, and we are organizing this as a side event of the 66th session of the ACHPR. And for today's session, we would like to explore what it means to be a young African, also what is related to access to civic space and the impact that COVID-19 is having on that, and also the participation of young people at the African Commission. So as an introduction, this session is based on the fact that the young Africans have been attending sessions at the African Commission, and so many things have been done, so many things have been said. And the African Commission that happened this year happened to be in another context because of the COVID-19 situation. And the question is now that maybe if it's time to reevaluate what it means to be young African, and what is the participation of these young Africans at the African Commission, but also how the situation with COVID-19 can help to improve the advocacy of young people at the African Commission. I'm going to start with the first reflection, the first question, and I'm going to ask if ever Harry could share with us what it means to be young in Africa and the reality when you are a minority.
Thank you, Oliver, for your question. Very, very poignant one over there. I think that what it means to be young in Africa, coming from a very Nigerian context, is just the fact that young people seem to are leading the front in innovation, right? So even though it seems like there's a lot of pushback from from the public sector, from government and all these things, we're getting to see young people trying to make a mark and doing what they do best, and trying to live their truth and just be themselves. And so but the reality is that even as regards even though young people are trying to do all of that, there's still a lot of pushback, right? There's still a lot of pushback. There's still a lot of there are systems that are not in place for them to be able to effectively manage and just live in that regard. And so I think that the reality for young people in Nigeria, in Nigeria, let me be specific because I don't live in other parts of the world, but I think that it has to do with constantly just trying to do your best, to be your best self, but still being limited based on resources, being limited based on just not having a healthy enough space to thrive, in as much as you're trying to just be this grand person. You can't figure out how to be able to maximize those spaces. And so that in itself is the reality of Nigerians everywhere. Yeah. For young Nigerians everywhere. However, I feel like there's just a lot that we can do, and there are ways that we can help young people thrive. Especially now that we're in the middle of a global pandemic, there are things that we can do to ensure that that happens. But yeah, I think that is it. That is it for me. When it comes to the realities of what it's like to be young, especially as a minority, in the African context.
Okay, thank you so much, Harry. I think I've touched something that is quite interesting at the beginning of what you said, is that you said that the young people are the front of innovation. And I would like maybe if ever you can share with us something around the access of equal rights, especially on the aspect of accessing to the civic space. What kind of mindset do queer people have, young queer people have, and when we know that sometimes they be evolving in contexts that are not always welcoming or inclusive, and even lacking also sometimes even role models to identify to. What kind of mindsets do these young people have when evolving in those contexts?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay. Um, Access to equal rights, and the mindset of queer people in Nigeria who are young and facing homophobia. I feel like, to be very to be fair, it's not like queer people in the country are just moving around, figuring out, oh, okay, this is what we're doing. We're just going to be out here, just living life, doing our things. Yes, we're living life, but the truth is that the homophobia confronts everybody on a regular. So no matter your social class, no matter your religious standing, no matter where you are, homophobia seems to find you, and homophobia makes it hard for queer people to thrive in the country. And so we find a lot of young queer Nigerians are looking for ways to leave the country, to move to spaces where they can be respected, where they can be loved, where they can thrive. And so I think that is the reality. There's no equal, there's no access to equal rights. If you're a young queer person, it's going to be hard for you. If you're a young queer woman, it's even worse, right? So with GBV, and with all these issues that are constantly plaguing just sexual minorities in general, it is hard to thrive in a space like that. And so when you grow up facing homophobia from like your family, from your friends, from your religious institution, it it makes it hard for you to be your authentic self. It makes it hard for you to be productive. It makes it hard for you to be able to take chances and just do stuff that normally if you were in a city and in a country that support that validates your existence, if you're in that space, you probably be doing more. But because you are in a space that from every aspect of your life, from when you are growing up, you've been told that you're an outcast and you cannot be anything more than that, then you now begin to see that, okay, you are living your life in the shadows. You don't want to be too, you're trying hard not to be too, what's the word? You don't want to be too in everybody's faces. So you try and, do things subtly. When your other counterparts are just raising the trail, even though even if you are trying to, you try very hard to separate that from like your personal life, and so it just even, and then it's hard to find community when you are living like that. When you are confronted with homophobia on every level, it's hard to find community. And so you don't even know is who you can talk to about your situation and your issues. And so we find that a lot of queer people are deciding to leave the country. They're seeking ways to move to like places like Canada, to places like the Netherlands, to the United States, to the UK, and even South Africa. People are moving to South Africa, just to find good, just to be in a space where their existence is not invalidated. So that is the reality, and that is the mindset that they have. the fact that, oh, I cannot thrive in this country, let me find somewhere else where I can be. Oliver?
Yes, thank you so much, Harry. And I think there's something there's something else interesting that you just said, is that homophobia comes in addition of all the other pushbacks that the young people are facing, but you can see that it's one thing that is pushing young people to actually leave their countries, leave their own spaces, and go seek where safety elsewhere where it's possible. And this is done for security purposes, but also for mental health ways of evolving. And I think this is something that is important. And for the moment, I would like to to go to maybe another reflection and something that is around the young people who actually decide to stay, decide to be in those countries, and then decide to actually engage to access to the civic space. And I would like to ask this question to Wima. And it's a question around why and how is it important and vital for young people to access to the civic space and to position and in positions of leadership.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to start by saying I personally think it's a bit sad that in 2020, and we found ourselves still having to debate the question of the importance of having young people in positions of leadership, and still having to continuously like bring the subject to the table. But if we think about it, like the notion that maturity comes with age has in a way long been a reason for leadership attainment in African society. Like, for example, leadership roles were previously always divided based on age, where the elderly were naturally considered leaders in their places. But things like have been changing, but going back to what I said in the beginning, maybe they haven't been changing as fast and as sustainably as we want it and we aspire for it to be. So answering your question about the importance having young people in positions of leadership, I think I could go on and talking about this subject and trying to in a way convince others about it, but I decided to only pick two words in a way. They are change and need. The first one, change, starting with the fact that young people are always like more open to embrace change, as to speak. Like young people are the ones bringing the new ideas, embracing what's coming, and trying to bring new things to the table, talking about subjects that maybe other people have not thought about, and or maybe they don't see why we need to think about these things. And the second point is need. As if we talk about the young people, I don't think there's anyone that would understand our needs as much as we would. So being the persons living in our realities, facing the issues that we are facing, seeing things from our perspectives, I would say we are the best to know what we need exactly and what could be done to change things and maybe to avoid some of the things that Harry talked about in the beginning, and some of the solutions, like I would say the first solutions of being able to leave country and seek a better life in elsewhere.
Thank you so much, Wima. I think there's something that you said around the fact that young people, as the ones who are concerned by their own issues, it's very important for them to find solutions that are narrowed to what they see as change or what they see as realities, which means that it's very important to have young people in positions of leadership because they are the ones who know the kind of change they want and how they want it.
Exactly.
I'll go, yes, I will step ahead and ask another question. Um, you, you as a non-binary person, but also someone who's biologically born female, there's still a certain reticence to access to certain spaces, and this is something that doesn't allow people, young people like yourself, young people like me who are in those contexts, to decide how to engage. And I would like to know, how does it feel to try to access and participate in these civic spaces that are not necessarily always welcoming?
Well, I would say that most of the time you get like two feelings about this. Like the first one is like it's always not nice having the feeling of not being welcomed and not being not belonging in a certain space. But at the same times, it also feels very empowering knowing that you're taking that space yourself. Like you're not asking for it, but you're taking it. Like you're not waiting for people to give you the permission. So you have to be the one to actually go and advocate for your rights and speak up and not like I said, wait for others. Um, and as difficult as it is, it's something that needs to happen and that it needs to take place. Like I said, when talking about the need of young people and the need here and more specifically the need of the community, the need of the queer community, um, we are the ones who know what we're facing. We are the ones knowing our realities, and if we do not snatch those places and if we do not create our own space, I don't think the change is gonna take place as much as sustainably as we want it and as efficiently as we want it to happen.
Okay, thank you so much. I think you just said something that is very, very, very important. The fact that people have to step ahead and speak from themselves and ask for inclusion and ask for things to change. And I think this is something interesting that is also inspiring to all of us. And I'll go and step ahead to the next question. The next question is around the fact that some young people have managed actually to access to certain spaces like the African Commission and the other spaces of decision. And I would like to to go to Dumiso and go and ask something around the fact why the youth advocacy had to expand to the African Commission and why is it even an important thing?
Thank you, Oliver. I think it's really quite critical for us to acknowledge and recognize that young people need to occupy space, and not just young people, but young people in their diversity. But that occupying of space requires a certain amount of power that would be inherent, but also is quite external. And having said that, we need to acknowledge and recognize that there is a need for long-term evidence building, documenting human rights violations and abuses, particularly around some of the lived experiences that wouldn't necessarily reflect in normative civic space development or other policy making, whether it's documentation mechanisms or evidence building. And I think what's also critical about this is the ability to then also institutionalize strategic litigation, because not a lot of organizations have obviously institutionalized it. I think looking at evidence around registration cases, or even just challenging sodomy or same-sex intercourse laws, you find that a lot of this emanates as a result of resourcing, and that that power is really quite inherent when you are a lot more institutionalized. Youth-led organizations aren't always institutionalized. I think there have been inroads, definitely inroads, specifically with youth-serving organizations and around accountability mechanisms, whether you're speaking to issues of SRHR at a sub-regional level, or when you're speaking to actually being able to participate in different initiatives, specifically in Banjul. And I think what we need to also then recognize is that there's a need for the institutionalization of youth organizations in a way that not only allows for strategic litigation or evidence building, but allows for movement building. Because I think there have been certain opportunities that have allowed young activists to be able to establish their own organization, be part of several youth networks, such as the African Queer Youth Initiative, but the movement building aspect is still quite demarcated if it's not according to linguistic barriers such as Lusophone, Francophone, then it might be subject to more demographic specific, whether they will say women-led or for instance, MSM, if you're speaking to the HIV response. So I think it's really quite critical for us to recognize and acknowledge that young people can only really express, occupy, and I guess even make an impact, not just specifically at the African Commission, but also in other AU mechanisms as a result of not just the creating of opportunities around it, but also really, individuals having, and I don't want to say capacity, because I think young people always have had the capacity. I think it's about being able to link the areas in which they are strong in. So if it's, for instance, grassroots activism, how then do we create a bridge between that and, for instance, the African Commission sessions? How do we then create a bridge between documenting and being able to participate in, for instance, parallel reporting or shadow reporting, as others might know, or be able to follow the rules of procedure in being able to access the African human rights system. So I think there's several facets, and it's really quite complex, and it's I don't think it's ever linear. There isn't one solution to all, but I think the fact that there are shared struggles across those linguistic barriers, there are shared struggles across the politics of identities, there are shared struggles across the competencies that different queer youth organizations have, it then allows for us to then be able to build that evidence, institutionalize, and also build movements.
Thank you so much, Dumiso. There were some moments when you were cut off, but I think you've stated three important things: the importance of long-term evidence building, the inroad of the youth agenda, and how it's somehow replicating, albeit the conflict in youth serving versus the youth-led organization, and also how to try to bridge the areas in which the young people have more capacities, and how to work better to strengthen the advocacy and push forward the actions of young people at the African Commission. I'll go and ask maybe another question to you is between all of those actions that have been happening, what should we learn? What is the one thing that we should learn that came out well, and that we can say that from this point, the whole advocacy of young people have been going on this way. And from this point, this is a major base on which we can build other strong actions.
Thank you, Oliver. I'm not sure if I got it right, but I think, maybe just to initially present a challenge to that is, what do we deem as a success in, for instance, participating in the African human rights system? Does it mean that the lives of those on the ground back home have changed? Does it mean that government will take a turn and maybe, allocate certain budgets to better improve lives? Doesn't mean that they will take up recommendations. And I'm saying this within the context of the fact that many governments do already participate in many other treaty bodies and special procedures, whether it's CEDAW, whether it's, for instance, the African peer review mechanism. And I think, there's a certain political will that in its abstract self, ultimately determines how effective, young queer activism can actually be. And I think, if we're to sit and really speak about, occupying space, then it should be, being able to not just be able to present our narratives, but at least being able to have conversations that will lead to follow-up action back home. I think that's what can really be deemed as somewhat a success. And I think we can all acknowledge that, we can always limit ourselves to certain outputs. And this is now speaking in an M&E language, but we can always limit ourselves to certain outputs, whether, whether it's a statement being made, whether it's a shadow report being submitted. But if we don't link that to any of the other processes that exist, for instance, Agenda 2063, or any country's national plan, or any country's even if there is, litigation at a country level, if we're not able to actually ensure that, part of the arguments have incorporated, certain positions or communications that have come from the African Commission as a result of our activism, then it might just be fruitless. So I think it's really quite critical in being able to create synergies or create links with other mechanisms and other processes that happen in country or even at a sub-regional level, because then that is what can not only sustain impact, but that can also ensure that there can be accountability. Because I can tell you that, particularly our own government will communicate something or say something that's quite affirmative at the Universal Periodic Review, but when you're at a follow-up review process, you then find out, that there was no progress, or they've omitted certain aspects, or they've just decided not to try and implement any follow-up at all. And so when you're to look at, for instance, the African Commission and how, I think in the first, not the first, but the second and the third cycles, the government had not participated because of the administration at the time. And more recently in 2018, in participating and providing periodic reviews for 2 different cycles, I think that then also is supposed to speak to something that's positive. But if we're not able to then translate that on the ground, whether it's in, policy briefs, or whether it's in part of the technical working groups within, for instance, the Ministry of Health and Wellness, or whether it's within the African peer review mechanism, which is currently going through a reporting process right now in country, then we will not only limit ourselves in terms of impact, but then we will not sustain the inroads that we're gaining. I think, if we're to speak about, for instance, 11 June 2019, which was obviously a milestone in terms of strategic litigation and also just decriminalizing same-sex intercourse, that in isolation cannot be deemed a success, because we must acknowledge and recognize that systemic impediments to freedom, systemic impediments as a result of stigma, discrimination, harmful gender norms, limitations within the judiciary, Botswana being the second highest country in terms of rape incidences of rape per capita, I think you then realize that on the ground, there's still a significant amount of work that needs to be done. And this is why I think it was very critical for me to speak to evidence building, institutionalizing strategic litigation, to safeguard that accountability, particularly for young people, to then be able to galvanize, build, or rather movement build around some of these issues and be able to link them with other, processes or just, I guess, rights issues that occur in country. And I think within the context of COVID-19 and all these illuminated inequalities, it's then it then brings an opportunity to then, at least present that, there were certain shortcomings that were identified at one of the cycle or periodic reviews. And it's really critical for us not to forget that, because we're still having the same kinds of conversations, we're still getting the same kinds of media reports, and civil society is still having the same systemic challenges, particularly in responding to the needs, challenges, and complexities of young people, but also specifically young, diverse, and queer people.
Okay, thank you so much, Dumiso. So I think the good thing is this is it. Everything is part of a plan that can that is understandable, a plan that can be organized locally, but also to the level of the African Commission. And I think from the inputs that young people may continue to be doing, and the understanding, which is very important, I think the actions are going to be effective. For now, I'm going to move to everyone.
Oliver?
Yes, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? Can others hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes. Dumiso, can you hear us? Okay. I think we are losing Dumiso, but
Okay, we might
we
just
make
have some technical challenges. I hope I am so audible.
yes, you are.
Oliver, you're unmuted, but you're not audible.
I'm actually hearing you. I can hear you.
Oliver, I can hear you, and Dumiso, I can hear you.
Dumiso, are you there?
Okay, maybe if I can just help a little bit. I think, having just brought an issue about COVID-19, it's really quite critical in terms of the reality that youth leadership now is dependent on the digitalization of activism, and how then do we, relate, or how do we then occupy space within the context of a more virtual world, and specifically within some of the African human rights mechanisms such as the ACHPR. And I'll be very curious if I can then maybe ask Harry, how your perspectives, particularly with the variant roles that you serve in, and in being able to, I guess, maybe digitalize your activism. What has your perspective been, particularly in being able to link and bridge different perspectives across the, queer youth spectrum, particularly in trying to create an impact during COVID-19 and the related crisis that is created across the economic, political, and civic space paradigms?
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Harry.
Okay. I think from time, I have always worked in the digital media space, right? I'm familiar with we work in digital media space. I'm trying to make young people have access to information through digital media means. And so coming into advocacy with that mindset is, so has helped us, and has been like our forte, our blueprint. And so when COVID came and when the pandemic
Harry,
started,
I can't hear you. I'm not sure if I'm the only one who can't hear.
Dumiso, we actually can hear you, and maybe you can check with your mic if ever it's working. Yeah, it's working.
I don't know if I should go on. Can I go ahead and continue?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Okay. So I'm saying that we have had just basically it's been the blueprint for, you know, to just do work digitally and to just be able to bridge media and advocacy. And the best way to do that is through digital media, especially if you're trying to reach young people who are the ones who are very much what's the word, who spend a lot of time on digital platforms like social media and websites and etc. And so when COVID happened, it was the perfect opportunity to think of all these ideas that we had. So for example, for International Youth Day, we had a virtual panel discussion that we streamed live on Facebook that had great that had a lot of great great reception. And basically what we spoke about was, you know, access to how do we get access, you know, how can young people find access to SRHR information and things that they need for their SRHR, right? And so we did that virtually, streamed it on Facebook, put it on YouTube. And so we figured out ways. The pandemic has shown us inroads, you know, to be able to take when doing advocacy, right? And since everybody is now digital, everything is now online, because of the pandemic, we need to now intensify efforts in that regard. And so what can we do in that regard? We need to be able to equip young people, you know, with the means to have the resources, you know, to be able to access this information online. Because to be fair, you need a certain level grade of smartphone to be able to have this conversations. You need to be able to afford data to be able to on your phone, so that you can be able to live stream or be a part of these conversations, right? And so the pandemic in itself has showed us innovative ways, but it's still very exclusionary because of, you know, the power dynamics and classism and all these other isms that exist in amongst African young people, and then African queer young people who may not necessarily have access to these things because of whatever reasons that they have, people who maybe don't have jobs or don't stay with family. And so we now start to think about what can we do? How do we start to let young people have access to this information? What do we do about data? How do we get them to be able to join in? And even if they join in, how do we get them to be able to stay in and, you know, share their issues, right? And so advocacy during we need to rethink youth advocacy right now during this COVID-19 pandemic. But we also need to understand that a lot of young people don't have the access that we have to be able to stay online and be online. So are we going to do interventions in that regard? Are we going to, in our intervention planning and in our budgeting and speaking to donors and whatever it is that we're doing, are we going to be able to involve the fact that we need to also equip young people with the means to be able to participate in these conversations, right? And if by now, I mean, we're having this discussion, and this is a part of, you know, a larger continental based discussion that we're having. You know, without COVID, we would have probably we may have had to have the conversation. You know, it may just be a group of people that would hear it in a very small space in some country, right? Now we have the chance to get everybody across, African young people across the world, to listen to the conversation. But the question is, how do we get them to tune in? Now the information is here now for them to everybody to have access to. How do we get them to be involved digitally? So I think that is the question that we need to start answering. How can we get our young people to have access to this information that we are sharing out? Our advocacy messaging, how do we get them to hear it? How do we get them to see it online? Do we need to find other digital ways? Is our webinars, our Facebook Lives, all these things, are they exclusionary to a certain regard? Are there cheaper, more affordable ways we can do our advocacy online, digitally, you know, that will still help these young people have access to this information? So I think these are the conversations that we need to have when discussing the innovative ways we can, you know, do advocacy right now in the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Harry. I think I think there's a couple of things that you just mentioned that are sparking in me some few other questions, and if you can allow me, I'm going to ask you, and I'll just rewind a little bit, and to what you just said. You just said that digital have been embraced to a certain extent, have been embraced by young people who are most of the time in major cities, but there are also other young people who don't have access to the digital world, and that it's the main question that is there. How do we get them involved and active and participating when the access to the digital world is still unequal, and but also the means and abilities to use and to be safe in the digital world is still, to a certain extent, also a problem. And for this perspective, you just shared around what it means for young people to be evolving in this situation, in this context. I would like you maybe to explore or maybe to share what are your thoughts on the fact that spaces like the African Commission are also spaces where that are not exclusively for young people, where there are also other generations, where there are also other people with other contexts. And my question here is around the aspect of how actions that are being done at the actions that are being done at the African Commission, what good can they benefit from this digitalization that is happening and that the young people are already embracing slowly but surely?
Oliver, can you just help me? I really don't get the question. Can you just help me rephrase it a bit, please?
So the question is, a space like the African Commission is a space where there's also other generations, and these generations are not in the same type of mindset, maybe like the young people who are already trying to embrace the digital world. And I would like to know how can this digitalization can help the African Commission to be more inclusive, to be more participative.
Well, I think that we all know that a lot of Africa's population is between the age of 15 and 35. We know that young people make up the bulk of our continent, right? And I think that we need to get to a space where we need to start including them in our policies. And so digitalization is a very great tool for us, for the African Union to the African Commission to explore, in the sense that, okay, what is our message and what are we trying to push this in this particular year? You know, how can we now involve everybody, right? And I think it starts with empowering young people and just giving them and just including them in decision-making processes, giving them a say, giving them a seat at the table, carrying them along, working with the private and the public sectors. And there are a lot of young people doing amazing things in both sectors. So how do we draw from their wealth of knowledge, and how do we get them involved in the planning processes, right? And also, how do we start creating inroads for people who are in marginalized groups to have a say and have a seat at the table, right? And so my recommendation would basically be creating more avenues for young people to participate, right? So thankfully we are having this conversation right here, right now. So do we need more platforms like this where we can have these conversations? How do we create those platforms? Certainly now that we are in a, like I said, in a COVID-19 pandemic world where to be able to navigate it, you need to have good resources, right? You need to be able to have a sustainable amount of money to be able to, come online and have these conversations for a long period of time. You also need to be able to have some form of financial stability and security to be able to be in your homes and not go out, right? Or even if you're going out, to be able to create how you step out of your house, how you interact with other people and all that stuff. So we need to even do a lot of groundwork. There's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done in helping to mobilize people to create I would say to just figure out incentives and figure out how do we empower our young generation? How do we give them the resources that they need to be able to thrive? I think that is something that we need to start focusing on, right? How do we give them jobs? How do we give them access to spaces where their voices can be heard? I think when we start from there, we can now start to have a much more larger conversation about being inclusive, because right now it's like, we're not even in these spaces at all. So how do we get people into these spaces? How do we empower them to be in these spaces? What are we doing about education? What are we doing about access to information in the various countries on the continent? So I think that is the place that we can actually start from, and then we now move ahead from there.
Thank you, Harry. This is a very important feedback that you just did, and I think there's one point of something that you said that is very important, and you said that the digitalization is already a step forward. That young people are in it. They are trying to go with the flow and understand better how they can use that in their advantage. And I think you also said that policies are not dead, which means policies are still effective and they can still help for making the inclusion in the African Commission, the inclusion of young people, more of a reality. And I will go and maybe ask you a last question. I'll go and maybe ask you a last question around the fact that these policies that can still be made, how can they make sure that participation of young people is effective? I'll ask that maybe in another way, how the policies that are being made at the African Commission can get inspired by the change that is happening, and by the embrace that young people are doing with the digitalization.
I think like I had mentioned before, having a seat at the table is very important. And I feel like you can only make policies that affect young people with young people. We have to find ways to include them in these processes. We have to find ways to to just have them in the room. And how do we have them in the room? We have to train them. We have to intentionally build a new generation of leaders, and we cannot start when they are 40 or when they are 50. We start when they are in their 20s, right? We start from when they're in university, right? And so there's a lot of intentionality that needs to go into it. There's a lot of, and that's maybe inclusion. Inclusion is not something that you do just because. It's something that is intentional. You say, okay, fine, I'm intentionally including these people in these spaces because I know that their feedback is very valid, and they will contribute in a very unique and in a new way that we've not seen before. And so I think that there has to be a very intentional inclusion of young people in the processes. There are young people in the tech industry who are doing amazing work, right? There are young people in the CSO space who are doing amazing work, who are even familiar with the African Commission's processes. They know what these processes are. So why don't we include them in these conversations? Why are they not in the rooms when these decisions are being made, right? Do we need to have a representative in the room? Do we need to have like three reps in the room? These are the conversations that we need to have. How can we be intentional in putting them in those spaces? And I think once we can do that, then it's only normal that when they are in the rooms, whatever policies, whatever discussions are going to be had, will go through these people, and they'll be able to give a different perspective to the issues and be able to say, okay, I think that we should actually do things this way. I think that this will work best for us this way. Or I think we need to create a policy, you know, that would affect us positively this way. Or I feel like this policy that we're trying to put out is not going to have a negative impact on the young people across the continent. So I feel like we need to get them in the rooms. That is the first step. And how do we get them in the rooms? We need to train them. We need to equip them. We need to provide them with resources, right? Yeah, I think that is basically what I feel.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we got the points. There's one point around the democratization of this digitalization for young people, and also to make sure that these young people keep being involved in the decision making and the policies drafting with the perspective that this is going to empower them, is going to help them to be more participative and with chance that they can be effective when trying to bring the change that they want. And for my next question, we will still here, we're still in this digitalization, the virtual globalization of advocacy that we are going in. I'm going to ask a question to Wima, and my question is going to be around the access of civic space, because you can tell that the civic space, with the civic space, we are evolving, we are going online, everything is turning virtual, and I would like to ask Wima how a space like the African Commission can get inspired to make access to civic space, this digital civic space that we are moving in, how the African Commission can be inspired or help to make it a priority, but also something that can be safe for young people.
Yeah, hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah, I can hear you perfectly. Yeah, I think your question is very related to what Harry was talking about previously, and just wanted to jump in a way said that we all have like a set of certain privileges, and I think the best way we could use these privileges is to put them in action and find ways how to actually help others in a way who do not have those privileges. Like, for example, the access to information, the knowledge that we have. I consider that as a huge privilege that we sometimes tend to forget that it is considered as a privilege, and we tend to forget that it should be shared with everyone. So maybe we could start with that, like how to share the informations we have, how to share this knowledge and put it in use with the other young people, and also considering, like, taking into consideration certain groups of people who do not have access to digitizations, who do not have internet or computers, or the possibility to actually go online and follow certain information. So I think that's one of the things that needs to, we need to focus on more, and we need to think about even more, because even our presence here and talking about these subjects and having this panel and having people participating in this panel is actually considered as sets of privileges.
Okay, thank you so much. As from what I was asking, do you think there are ways that the African Commission can help to make this access more safe for young people? Because from what Harry also said, is that young people still lack these. The young people still lack the necessary resources to access to the digital world, and security is one of the resources that can be needed. Do you think there's anything that the African Commission can contribute to that, in the sense that participation can be more safe, more more welcoming and less problematic for young people?
Yeah, I think the best way to actually answer that question and get the ways on how to do these things more secure way is actually to reach out to these people and see their point of view. Like, for example, we could start by announcing that this is a safe space to begin with, and firstly starting by assessing if it is a safe space, like online speaking, for people to access these like information, information, and not like have any risks for when it comes to their personal safety. And it depends more on the situation of each person and each group of person. Like, it could be physical security that we could talk about, or online security. It actually depends on the group of people. So the best way is to reach out to different groups, assess the situations, and work with them to have the best solutions. I don't know if that replies to the question or not.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rima. I'll go and move to Dumiso. From what Dumiso have been sharing, they've talked about bridging context, bridging capacities and resources, so that these can help to continue supporting the emerging of a strong advocacy. And I would like to ask them, what do they think the global virtualization is going to bring to the youth advocacy at the African Commission?
Thanks, Oliver. Sorry, I think my technical whatnot, even though I thought it was quite stable, just went haywire. And I think this is really quite reflective, specific to your question, is that, despite the digitalization and despite, everything now somewhat being a lot more virtual, particularly when we're looking at, for instance, African Commission sessions or even UN sessions, knowing full well that, it was more recently the UN General Assembly. We must acknowledge, and I think this also then also speaks to, safety. As you're saying safety, I was thinking, we must acknowledge that digital expression isn't always safe for queer folks, and that there are significant infrastructural challenges beyond just access. For instance, the bandwidth. For instance, can everyone be able, for instance, if there's like a icebreaker at a side event, or there's like an activity in which people now, for instance, would have to share their cameras, would everyone be able to do so? Would issues such as barriers of language no longer be there? And I think we must acknowledge that, the virtual world is really more a reflection of reality, in that access is still left to those who have the privileges or the means of, for instance, internet access, of the means of, for instance, computerware or the right software, or being able to have, for instance, hold a session that would be beyond, for instance, the 40-minute restrictions on a Zoom call. And I think these are quite critical and structural issues that we need to acknowledge and recognize that young people are subject to, not necessarily that they depend on. And that, especially when we're speaking about, queer individuals, we know that, home, school, the workplace, volunteer spaces aren't always safe. And so when we do, or when we are able to connect in person with our peers, a lot of the experiences are a lot more value adding, they're a lot more confidence building, they're a lot more, it's being in a space where people get it, where you don't have to consistently explain yourself, where you don't have to own poverty or identity, is really critical to belonging and really critical to development. And I think the fact that young people have been denied that, specifically young queer people have been denied that within this broader civic space that is quite virtual, we must acknowledge that a lot of those mechanisms of spaces such as the ACHPR still have issues of, for instance, accreditation, connection, still have issues on whether you're able to actually speak or not, still have issues of whether you can access policymakers or not. I know, you know, in the pre-COVID crisis era, you know, we had the same challenges, but we knew that if I were, for instance, in Banjul, it might just be easier for me to speak to someone from the government delegation in comparison to back home, where I would have doors closed on me or at me. And I think it's really quite critical for us to recognize that, yes, there are some benefits to everything being virtual. For instance, UN Web TV, for instance, is easily accessible even before parameters or precautions, and people were able to gain insight of whatever their, you know, member states would say and so forth. But I think that you know, it has only then sort of highlighted that it's still quite an elitist game, still quite, you know, more institutionalized organizations who would have, for instance, core resources or the privilege of resources able to pay salaries would be a lot more enabled, and it would be much easier for them to be able to participate, strategize, and continue their operations, even if they would be digital, unlike many youth-led organizations who still have challenges of funding and still have challenges of inadequate infrastructure, and the fact that, you know, there's a lot of unemployment and underemployment just makes it a little more glaring, in that youth organizations will consistently have systemic challenges that are not addressed, and they don't have that control, they don't have that privilege. They might have inherent power, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll still be able to, for instance, produce a shadow report or a parallel report to submit. It doesn't necessarily mean that they'll still have you know, the advocacy or the means for advocacy or follow-up actions post sessions. So I think it's really quite critical for us to acknowledge and recognize that you know, accessing and occupying space isn't so linear, and that there's so many other dynamics that are really systemic, and that are a lot more institutional than they are with respect to agency and efficacy of young people. And so, yes, there are some positives, but I think more glaringly now than ever, the systemic impediments, limitations, shortcomings, and challenges that youth-led organizations face today are even more glaringly so within the context of COVID-19 and the digitalization of civic space.
Okay, thank you so much. There's also one perspective that I was expecting you to explore. Maybe I can ask that as a question. You can tell us, because the digital world can help these young people to get proximity with governments or connection, conversations with governments. And in case, for example, of queer people who don't always have the opportunity to have conversations with government, or even a seat at the table where the government is present and can have a word to say on the situation or a consideration to make. I would like you to share how this digitalization, the virtual world, can help with that.
Sorry, Oliver, please just rephrase that a bit.
I was saying that the access to the digital world, you were sharing what good you think that it can bring to young people advocacy at the African Commission. And I was saying that certain categories of young Africans don't have opportunities to have a seat at the table, but also to participate in conversation, for example, with governments. And sometimes at the African Commission, governments are present, and from the good that the global virtualization is bringing, how do you think these young people who don't always have access to spaces where the government is present, how this global virtualization can help with that?
I think, I think because of just some of the limitations that I've mentioned, we must also recognize that, you know, having access to that table doesn't necessarily mean that there can be an impact or that you can speak. And I think, you know, for instance, when you then, let's say if there is a specific meeting, like for instance, more recently there was a SADC SRHR follow-up meeting, and obviously only member states were allowed to speak. You know, there are certain limitations in that you can't walk across and then be able to speak to a government official, right? And similarly, when you're to, for instance, if you're in Banjul, you know, maybe you'd be able to bump into because you happen to stay in the same hotel, or that, you know, they happen to be at a specific side event that you're attending, or you're a panelist, and then you'd be able to engage. So within the virtual context, I think it becomes a bit more challenging. But I must say that, you know, there can be possibilities, especially, for instance, if, you know, attendees or participants are in an email list, you know, for instance, and, you know, the government officials say, yeah, by all means, that you can be able to pop an email, but that isn't necessarily unique to the digitalization, and it's more so unique because of maybe what the organizer, or maybe a specific opportunity in terms of consultations. So I think, you know, and let us acknowledge that, you know, because COVID precautions are relaxing a bit, a lot of government officials still do prefer to meet in person. I mean, we in one of the sessions, one of the the African Youth Envoy had actually spoken to a 44 age gap between young people and political leaders. We must also acknowledge that, you know, our political leaders aren't always technologically savvy, and that there are obviously specific, or not specific, but there are unique challenges for even government officials to be able to engage with civil society online. You know, speaking just from a country context, as I was saying, with, you know, relaxed COVID precautions, you know, for instance, you find that government or rather state delegations that include civil society would, for instance, be in the same conference room, and they would be connecting virtually to engage on a specific mechanism, which I think is positive, and it's allowing for individuals to be engaged, to be able to engage, particularly on the sidelines or the margins of such meetings or engagements. But I think, you know, the virtualization allows for, you know, different young people to be able to connect, different young people to be able to strategize, to be able to commemorate, to be able to even feed into certain opportunities that maybe, for instance, the African Commission would have a call for inputs on reprisals, for instance, or it would have, you know, applications for certain working groups. And so I think that has made it a lot more easier because everyone now has to communicate virtually. So that means that opportunities are now virtual. It's easier to share. It might be easier to even then access that opportunity, or never mind that, but also to then collaborate with others in being able to create some form of an impact. So yeah, I think it's really quite complex. It's not so simple. Yeah, but it does. I think it provides a lot more opportunities for engagement, collaboration, but not necessarily specific to member states or government officials, because those are quite unique. And depending on the state or the willingness for government officials to be able to engage with civil society, I think then that's really ultimately at a country level rather than at a regional level. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it did. It did. Thank you so much. And I think, yeah, this is it. This was the ensemble of the questions that I had for you guys. And just a last one, maybe something for everyone. It's going to be around the fact that we've said that we've shared that there's a future of young people at the African Commission. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello?
Yes.
Yes, can
I can hear you.
Yes, I was saying that in few words, we've said that there's a future of young people advocacy at the African Commission. We've said that the digitalization is something that is being embraced by young people, and that the African Commission can still learn how to organize and be more welcoming. And my last question was around the fact. The thinking of where do we go next from here, from all of these points where we just um, we just saw these, from the participation to the digitalization to the opportunity that the online spaces are giving to young people to participate in the African Commission. Where do you think we can go next? Maybe each of us can just answer what they think can be the way to be the African Commission can be more effective for young people. We can still start with Harry.
I don't think I have much to say in this regard. I mean, I've said a couple of things already, but I'll just like to reiterate the importance
What's
of
the major one?
I'll just just intentionality is very key. Just to be able to have that young people are in the spaces that they need to be at when these decisions that affect their lives are being made. We don't want a situation where people that are making decisions about what would affect the lives of young people are not young themselves, right? Or don't have young people in the room. So for me, I want intentionality to include them, right? I'm not just saying it for, oh, we have a youth summit or a youth meeting or a youth debate. Let young people be a part of all the processes. So yeah, I think that for me is what I think is important.
Okay. Wima?
Hello,
Yes, we can hear you.
can you hear me? Okay, good. I think when thinking about the future and what comes next, what the thing that comes to my mind is just one word: solidarity. And solidarity in all its forms. Solidarity, like in smaller groups, solidarity between young people and older people. I mean, like really solidarity in all its forms to be able to achieve the things that we aspire to achieve.
Okay, thank you so much. Dumiso?
Thanks, Oliver. I think, for me, it's really quite critical to just speak to the reality that a lot of treaty bodies, special procedure mechanisms, or even policy-making spaces are still quite inherently limiting. We must acknowledge and recognize that institutional racism continues to exist. We must acknowledge that homophobia, transphobia, and other forms of phobias still do exist. So it's very difficult for young queer individuals to fully express themselves and fully collaborate and galvanize on creating an impact that would be lasting beyond that mechanism or beyond that opportunity to engage. And I think it's really critical for us to then also acknowledge that there needs to be a power shift. Young queer individuals should be enabled beyond just the normative capacity building or strengthening, but to allow for them to be autonomous in their agency and in their efficacy in a way that would truly transform communities, that would ensure that one is not just equipped, but that one can be able to translate the same impact at the African Commission as would be at the Committee Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or as would be at the high-level political forum. I think it's really critical for us to acknowledge and recognize that resourcing is a significant component of this. It is the one thing that will allow for young people to not only rest, to not only extend solidarity, but also to challenge those isms, neocolonialist policies, to challenge the limited responses that governments tend to give, or the lack of progress whenever a cycle report is presented, or the inability to take up the recommendations of civil society. So I think it's really critical for us to acknowledge that it should be a priority to resource the autonomy, the efficacy and agency of young queer individuals, organizations, movements, feminists across board in a way that can truly eliminate the systemic stigma, discrimination, racism, and impediments to our freedom. And not only just that, but also ensure that, Pan-African ideals that all countries had fought for towards independence can truly be reflective in the spirit of Ubuntu and in the spirit of being young and queer.
Okay, thank you so much, Dumiso. I think the three of you have shared important perspective, intersection, intergenerational solidarity, and also enabling young people to actually be able to be effective at the African Commission. And I don't know if in the participant of this this conversation, there's anyone who have a question who would like to ask something? If anyone have a question to ask to the panelists, to myself, before we resume with this conversation.
All attendees have the ability to unmute themselves and ask their question directly.
Yes. Okay, I think I'll go on and resume everything we just said in this conversation. We started exploring the fact that young people in Africa are the front of innovation, but sometimes they have pushbacks and other contexts that don't allow them to actually express themselves or actually put at the work what they can do as contribution. And homophobia is one of the aspects that even push young people to leave their homes, to leave their countries, to go and seek safety where it's possible. And from that, there are other young people who actually stayed in their countries and then who fight, who work to be resilient and try to be included in spaces of decision. And this is not always easy. This is not always possible. But one word: resilience. Resilience is what helped them to break through, to speak up, but also to actually question certain spaces and help them to be better, to be young friendly, to be inclusive. After that, we understand that being in position of leadership is one thing, but also having a meaningful participation in spaces like the African Commission is another thing that is important. At the African Commission, people still have to occupy the spaces. They still have to bridging bridging the efforts so that the participation can be effective, can have more results. And this is something that is being done in various ways. And today, with the digitalization that is happening due to the context of COVID, but also in general, is a situation that is bringing other aspects of the advocacy of the participation of these young people to the African Commission. And one of the things that we saw is that these young people still need to be supported with resources that can help them to engage better. But also the digitalization is something that still needs to be understood both at the end of the spectrum, from young people to the other generations that are participating in the African Commission. And the inclusion is going to happen when the African Commission can see beyond participation, but also include them in the policies, and help them to participate and actually be the ones who help to craft the kind of policies that are going to help organizing the kind of change that these young people want. And the digitalization is also bringing many good things, and is allowing more spaces at the table. And also the digitalization is helping these young people to reflect, to strategize the way it was already being done, but this time digitally, and of course with other means that can help more involvement of other young people. And one of the three things that young people may need from that is more of intersectionalities of actions, solidarity between the generation, but also the capacity to be enabled with enough resources to actually bring the kind of changes they want. And yes, I think this is all that we've been talking about. If ever there's anything else that the panelists would like to add to this, it's welcome.
I'm not sure if you guys can see the chat box, but there has been a question, and it is, what can the African queer youth themselves do to pave waves for themselves to be recognized in the relevant civic spaces?
Can you repeat, please?
What can the African queer youths themselves do to pave waves for themselves to be recognized in the relevant civic spaces?
Okay, I think this is a question that is open to the panelists and myself also. I don't know who would like to start. Dumiso, Wima?
Okay, maybe I can take that one. It's just I think what's critical, we must acknowledge that the narrative has always been, oh, young people must take up the mantle, young people are the leaders of tomorrow, and even in political manifestos or in any political narrative, you're finding people are speaking about young people's unemployment and young people not being able to be fully independent adults within the context of our complex socioeconomic countries. I think, in as much as young people can be able to make inroads themselves, you can make as much noise, you can be as radical as possible, but we must acknowledge that there are reprisals in different country contexts, and reprisals aren't always arbitrary arrests or a shutdown on protests or limitations to invites or opportunities, but they're also quite inherently economic. And in the context of digitalization, we're still finding that there are significant mental health implications as a result of people who are really quite vocal and who are making the noise. How impactful is that noise? Yes, people will then listen to us, but we still don't get a seat at the table. People will then appreciate whatever policy brief we've presented. It doesn't mean that it will inform whatever policy change would be effected. And I think that's really, it's not exclusive to now, 2020 or COVID era. In looking back at 1976 and the Soweto uprisings, schools were burned, young people were protesting, and people were shot. And we must acknowledge that apartheid actually only ended more than a decade later. We must acknowledge that civic space is subject to regulation, is subject to monitoring and oversight of government. And so essentially it's about, in as much as we can sit and say, it's not about who will let me, it's about who will stop me. The reality is that an environment will only be as enabling as a government will allow it to be. If it's not the government, then it would be a quasi-judicial body that would then either infringe on the freedoms of assembly and association, or even just law enforcement that will stop you from being able to have a strike. COVID precautions are obviously limiting, protesters who were fighting, specifically feminists who were fighting for food parcels or at least social protections amidst the hard lockdowns and states of emergency. Our own country now has just extended a 6-month state of emergency to a full year as at yesterday, or was it day before yesterday? And I don't know how that is acceptable in a democratic society. And I think, for me, it then reminds me that Nelson Mandela would have not been free if it was not for F.W. de Klerk and for having conversations at that time. So we must acknowledge that those who don't have power need to relinquish that power. And in as much as we can try and take that power, it doesn't necessarily mean that the institutions, the systems that keep them in power, the systems that continue to benefit those who have privilege and those who have power, it doesn't mean that us replacing them or us being able to fight against them or us being able to challenge them will mean that those systems are eliminated. So I think it's in as much as, from an ideation perspective, it's really quite critical for young people to create their own spaces, to create their own tables, to have their own conversations. We must acknowledge that this will then be in isolation of nationalists. This will be in isolation of religious fundamentalists. This will be in isolation of, the head of the household who probably works 200 kilometers away, but still dictates what kind of food is eaten in the household. So I think it's really critical for us to acknowledge and recognize that there are power systems that need to be eliminated and that young people can only go so far. This is why it's critical for us to have allies. This is why it's critical for us to have cross-movement building. This is why it's critical for us to have Pan-African ideals. This is why it's critical for us to be able to ensure that we're creating and collating the evidence strategically in a way that isn't limited within the parameters of the systems that continue to benefit the few and the elite and the educated and the heteronormative. So I think it's really quite critical, in as much as, yes, that conversation is important for us, to then be able to do as we can with what we can. We must acknowledge that power needs to be taken away and that we cannot do it in isolation as a specific demographic group. We need feminists, we need other institutions, we need billionaires to be able to pay their taxes, we need governments to be able to curb illicit financial flows so that there are enough resources for health, for strengthening judicial systems, for strengthening the African human rights system, in allocating the necessary funds and in being able to support civil society to participate in these mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dumiso. I don't know if there's anyone else who would like to do a contribution, or if ever there's any other question. Okay, I think we've come to an end of this conversation. If ever there's any other question or any other contribution before we close this session, it's welcome.
In the meantime, Oliver, just to let you know that all recordings, all webinars have been recorded, and we are working on a YouTube page where this recording, in addition to all of the others, will be publicly available, so we can also share that with you at a later stage, so you can share this video wherever you'd like.
Okay, okay. I think that is very important for other people who've not been able to attend this session to know more what it was about and how the conversation went. I think that is very important. Thank you so much. And I'll go and thank everyone who made it possible to attend this conversation. I will go and thank Isla for the organizing this space, and young people attending, participating to the African Commission is a conversation that can keep going on, and I think this was a base conversation of many other things that we can still do, many other things that we can still do for others, and yeah, I'll go and give a thumbs up to everyone who was here, who did contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you. Bye.